This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. The next Renegade University weekend is going to be amazing. It will be in my hometowns of Oakland and San Francisco the weekend of April 24th to the 26th. On Friday, I'll give a VIP walking tour of the rich renegade history of San Francisco before we have happy hour, dinner, and an after-dinner lounge at some of my favorite bars and restaurants in the city. On Saturday, the dazzling Daniel Coffeen, a star guest of the Unregistered Podcast, whose Nietzsche course for Renegade University immediately became one of our best sellers, will lead a discussion on seeing the world differently, with pleasure, in an era of meanness, narrow rationality, and dumb partisanship. Then, I will discuss the remarkable evolution of American political discourse from uptight puritanical rigidity to the norm-shattering interventions of our current Clown Prince president. I will also present the findings from the research for my upcoming book on the history of renegade American popular culture, subverting authoritarian regimes around the world. There will also be an open bar happy hour for all attendees on Saturday night, followed by what I think will be the highlight of the entire weekend, a party at the East Oakland Urban Farm that is now the underground headquarters of Renegade University. RU weekends are the highlights of my whole year, and I can't wait for this one. I hope to see you there. Go to renegadeuniversity.com/live for more info and tickets. That's renegadeuniversity.com/live. My guest this week was a national celebrity for advocating for the liberation of women from their traditional gender roles. Now, he's a pariah among feminists for promoting the liberation of men from their traditional roles. But he has always maintained that he has simply stood for the freedom for all of us to choose our own roles. This is my interview with Warren Farrell. I'm in a place I've been wanting to come for a very long time. I'm in the beautiful house of Warren Farrell in Mill Valley, California, in Marin County. And Warren, I've been wanting to have you on the show, as I told you before we started rolling, for a long time. I just haven't been able to get down here until now. It's a great honor because I find your career to be one of the most fascinating I've ever known about as a public intellectual, as a thinker, and an activist. And it's so rich. And the interesting thing is I had never heard of you until about whenever the Red Pill came out. I guess it was 3 years ago.
Yes,
like that.
Yeah, about 3 years ago.
And I was stunned that I had never heard of you because of how rich your career has been and how important it's been in so many ways, in different ways. And we can talk about why, but I think it's generational. I think people older than me know you, and people younger than me might know you because of the Red Pill, the movie, the film, the documentary film by Cassie J, in which you're one of the featured speakers. But I want to get into that. But what I really want to do is sort of introduce the audience to you and your life, and then we can talk and sort of talk about your ideas as we do that. Because your life and your career, as I said, is so long and so rich and so important, and I think a lot of people don't understand it. And I think also your ideas become easier to understand, or maybe easier to accommodate if people understand the context. And you're uniquely suited and skilled at interweaving the personal with the political. So I think you're almost in many ways the perfect unregistered guest. This is fans of the show know that's what we do here. And I don't think there's anyone who could be better at it than you. So why don't we start at the beginning? Well, let's do this. I mean, for people who don't know who you are sort of often characterized in very shorthand ways in the media as the father of the men's rights movement. And, that may or may not be true. I found you to be, in the red pill, to be the most interesting and the most sympathetic of all the representatives of the movement for a variety of reasons we can talk about. But let's go back to the beginning now. You were from New Jersey, born in New Jersey, right?
Yes, exactly.
You're a boomer.
Actually born in New York,
okay.
And then my family moved to New Jersey when I was about 5-6 years of age, and then came up to, and this is 1943 that I was born, and so then moved to Europe when I was 15 and 16, and that really was very crucial for me because I had been opposing the McCarthy era in my school and opposing my McCarthy era in the 50s in a high school led me to being accused of being a communist.
Oh.
And so then I went over to Europe when I was 14 and 15, and the people in Europe said, well, the Soviet Union and the United States, they're pretty much the same thing. They're bully nations. They're self-righteous. They think they know everything. And, and they're just two of a kind. And so that was really helpful for me because here I had felt very lonely and isolated, and suddenly by saying that we should, what I was saying in high school was, we should be able to be open. If we are really an advanced progressive nation, we should be listening to the Soviet point of view. We should be listening to our point of view. We should be exchanging information and hearing each other. And that was what got me labeled a communist. And even my father at one point, when I opposed the war in Vietnam, said he felt it was his moral obligation to report me to the government as a potential communist. And I had no interest in communism except to know about it. So it was like, and I actually am fairly strong on the initial value of capitalism and then its tendency to go off into profit making at the expense of other things, and therefore the need for checks and balances in government. And as I've come to be, have that same feeling about men and women, that men and women, that the way the children are raised the best is what I call a checks and balance parenting. You value what women tend to bring to the parenting table of nurturing and connecting and unconditional love, and you also value the male style of unconditional love, which is boundary enforcement and discipline to a greater degree. In most couples, and some couples are the reverse of that. And so, but the important thing is that when the mother says something like, sweetie, you can't climb the tree, and the dad says, well, go ahead and climb the tree, that the father and mother understand that the dialogue between the two of them is really what is best for the child, and it doesn't indicate because you disagree that you're ready for divorce. It indicates that you are doing good parenting. So hear each other out. And so anyway, I started to. I was teaching at Rutgers University. This is 1974, and I was doing my doctoral dissertation at NYU, and the women's movement surfaced. Actually, I said this is 1974. This is about 1970, and the women's movement surfaced, and I just took an interest in it. And because I was teaching political science at Rutgers, I was able to look at it as a political movement. And the students in my class said, Dr. Farrell, or actually at that time it was just Warren Farrell, you have fire in your belly when you're talking about the women's movement. You really just love it. But about half of the class of those years was opposed to it, and half the class was for it. So I started setting up listening things where the people who were for it argued from their perspective, and the people who were against it argued from their perspective. But I noticed that the debates only reinforced the biases that people had before the debate. So I had everybody in the class reverse roles, and the ones that were for it argued against it, and vice versa. And the students, and then I had them do things like role reversal dates in men's beauty contests, where I said, every woman is in a beauty contest every day of her life. So guys, if you want to understand what that feels like, participate in the beauty contest of everyday life that women go through. And then, when all the women were just cheering me and saying, yay, thank goodness this guy understands what it's like to be focused on as a sex object, I said, okay, now let's reverse roles. And women, your turn to ask the guys out that you're most attracted to and focus on the men that won the beauty contest as potentially the ones you're most attracted to. And the women go, oh, well, wait a minute here. And then, and then they were really fearful of asking out the guys, and they ended up feeling like they were jerks at the end of an hour's, class or so. And so the guys ended up saying, yes, that's the way we feel. Like we're always having to take initiatives. We have to risk rejection. To do that, we act like jerks. And the women were going, yes, and you get it, my perspective now too, which is that, that here I am. You guys understood now that you were focused on trying to get attention for your body, but then at the end you resented the fact that you were only getting attention for your body. And so, and so the class was really getting that there were there were many points of view on things, and you can't just get points of view by hearing people debate, because that tends to attract you to the side that you're already on. You have to reverse roles. You have to argue from the other side. You have to emotionally participate in somebody else's perspective. And that's what's led me now, maybe a half century later, to doing couples communication workshops, which I just finished one this weekend. At 1440 Multiversity, and I'll be doing it in a few weeks at Esalen, which is teaching couples to be able to hear personal criticism without becoming defensive. But what we have to understand is that becoming defensive was functional historically, because when you heard criticism of yourself, it could be an enemy, and so your job was to kill the enemy before the enemy killed you, and so that was very functional for survival. It's just terrible for love. Yeah.
Just like the Cold War.
Just like the Cold War. Just like the Republicans and Democrats today. Who could not hear each other. That's right. Just listen to the impeachment debates, and you heard a perfect example of nobody hearing anything but what they wanted to hear. Exactly. And so I began to start speaking about these things. But at the beginning, my interest in the women's movement led me to changing my doctoral dissertation topic, which I was only able to change because I was also assistant to the president of NYU, and my doctoral dissertation committee were afraid of objecting to my changing. And so they gave in, because they just all thought the women's movement was going to be a fad. And it was a fad, will be a fad, and we'll just out. And I said, no, it's going to be part of an evolutionary shift. For the first time in history, we have the freedom to be able to be free of survival as a focus. And so this was before the belief was that we were dominated by a world of patriarchy in which men made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women. So I didn't have to argue that argument. But what I argue now is that we weren't dominated by a patriarchy. We were dominated by the need to survive. And to survive, women in most cultures raised children, and men in most cultures raised money or some equivalent of money, like killing an animal. And so it wasn't that our grandparents and great-grandparents, they did not have privilege. They had responsibility. They had obligations. And, when I started to talk to, teach psychology and train psychologists around the world, my father was worried. He said, you can't train people to do what they want to do. You have to train people to do what they need to do. Doing what they want to do will make them weak and not able to do what they need to do. And so all these things I started to begin to find and feel and try to communicate in the culture. And so I was very supportive. I was like, I think it's fair to say that for a number of years in the 70s, I was the world's leading male feminist and spoke all around the world on feminist issues. Sure. And I felt very strongly about that until in the mid-70s, I began to do research that showed me that children of divorce who do not have a lot of father involvement, those children do very poorly on average. Some not, but and women. So we have here these single mothers who are just feeling overwhelmed. We have dads who are feeling left out, and we have children who are doing much worse. And so I'm explaining this to the board of directors of the National Organization for Women, which is what I was elected to in about 1970. And those were the ones that were recommending me to do 50 to 60 speaking engagements per year. And so I was, earning an extremely good living from doing these speaking engagements so frequently on the women's movement. But when I brought up to the board of directors of now that I was on, that there was that the research is beginning to show that children raised with minimal or no father involvement, those children do not do well on average, and some of them do very well, but it's the exception rather than the rule, and that that there's something happening here, and we all here at Now care a great deal about our children, do we not? And there was sort of a silence. And of course, everybody did, but they cared more about something else in the children. They cared more about women's freedom to be able to raise the children the way they thought was best after divorce. They cared about women's freedom to be able to raise children by themselves without being married and having to be tied to a man. They didn't feel that the family was that important. They felt that women's rights was more important. And my response was, women absolutely have to have the right to have children if they want to have children, but the moment they choose to have children, which is their right, and they should have no freedom, that should not be taken away from them. But when you make the free choice to have a child, you make the free choice to put your child's interest before your freedom. That's the choice. That's the responsibility that comes with that choice. That's the deal. And if your children are not doing well because you want to get a divorce and move to another state with a different man and leave the biological father behind, that seems reasonably okay until you find out that the research shows that those boys especially tend to feel abandoned and devastated and don't have a male role model that they really feel is their male role model. And here I was a stepfather when I was doing this research, and I was wanting to feel that, well, no, wait a minute, a stepfather can be just as good as a biological father, but I couldn't find any research to back up my desire to have that be true. And so, I found that it was that children really are on some level that we're only beginning to understand through epigenetics and other research, that children are that there is an attachment to the biological father, and the biological mother too. That when a child looks in the mirror and what a boy sees is the body language of his dad, the eyes, the hair of his dad, and so if he's being told by the mother in a divorce situation that the dad is sort of irresponsible, a narcissist, and a liar, that boy is going to look in the mirror and wonder, well, gee, I'm looking in the mirror, maybe I'm a narcissist. I did lie, maybe I'm a liar, and he's going to feel the guilt of the fear that he's going to be the negative things his dad is portrayed as being. But he can't talk to his dad about it, and he can't talk to his mom about it, because if he talks to either one about it, he'll further destabilize a situation that he's already worried about being destabilized. And so these are some of the disparate thoughts that have led me to sort of saying the women's movement is wonderful for expanding the options of women, but demonizing men and saying that all masculinity is toxic and that men have male privilege. Yes, there's a lot of masculinity that's toxic, but it didn't come from male privilege. It came from male sacrifice. The sacrifices we had to make to be disposable in war and disposable in the workplace, that disconnected us from ourselves in order to be able to give women female privilege, to give women the female privilege of being able to be home and safe, while no man had that privilege in World War I or World War II.
Yes. When I heard you say this at the Red Pill and elsewhere, I was wiped out, because I have been studying these issues and thinking about them very hard for decades, and it had never occurred to me that men are oppressed in their own ways. That men are the ones who as you said, who go to war. They're the ones who are drafted. They're the ones who work in coal mines and as lumberjacks, the worst, hardest, most dangerous, most deadly professions. The problem I had with a lot of other so-called men's rights movement leaders is that they tend to talk about, I think, as if they've been oppressed by women, that women have imposed these things on men. They sort of flip the script in a way. But the thing I liked about you so much is you don't do that, right? You say, let's, rather than talk about a matriarchy or a patriarchy forcing each gender into these roles, let's talk about liberating both or everyone from these expectations and these roles, right?
I am very, very solidly clear, and have been from the very beginning, that I'm not in favor of a women's movement hating men or a men's movement hating women. I'm in favor of a gender liberation movement, freeing both sexes from the rigid roles of the past to more flexible roles for our future.
Yeah.
And, and as you've heard me say, we're all in the same family boat. When only one sex wins, both sexes lose. Mm-hmm. If you have a man that is not growing up to be functional, successful, happy, focused, you have a woman who loses a man who's functional, successful, happy, mm-hmm. focused. Mm-hmm. Women who are heterosexual, who want men to marry and who want to have a good father, they lose when a man loses.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was Warren Farrell 101, everyone. But there's much more to say. I want to pause and track back now that you've laid out many of your core ideas. Go back into your history a little bit more again. So, first of all, I didn't know about the Soviet Union thing, and it's a brilliant analogy. This Cold War between these hostile forces, and you were interested in discussion, dialogue, learning from one another. Mm-hmm. Even if you can be fully anti-communist as I am, mm-hmm. there are certainly going to be some things you can learn from mm-hmm. the experiences of the Soviet people, at the very least, right?
Absolutely.
Your father apparently was not so keen on that.
Yes, he loved me, and he was a wonderful dad.
Okay, well, that's what I was going to ask you about.
He wanted me to be safe in the world,
okay.
And he knew that in the McCarthy era, speaking up about about being open to a communist perspective was not a very functional way to be.
So he was just being protective then.
I think he was being protected, and then he also believed in he had a very strong belief in capitalism and a very strong belief in the evils of communism. So that was also true.
Well, I've never heard you talk. Maybe you have, but I've never heard you really talk about your parents and your childhood, which mm-hmm. I think must be very important here, especially mm-hmm. given your subsequent career. So your father was an accountant, is this right?
My father was an accountant,
okay.
Correct.
And what was he like as a father, and what was your relationship like?
He was a good father, and the relationship was quite good. I mean, I saw him give up being when we lived in Europe when I was 14 and 15, as I mentioned, mm. and then my mother was very depressed when she was over there because she had no friends, and she hated the amount of rain we experienced in the Netherlands, and we lived in The Hague and Holland, and so she wanted to come back here to the United States, and my father quit his job as a manager of a company in Holland, and so he was in his late 50s at the time that he did that, and so there was not very many companies willing to hire him at that point in time, so he sold encyclopedias from door to door.
Wow.
And so he said to me once, it's very hard on me to be a manager of a significant company and now be selling encyclopedias from door to door. I feel like my whole career has led nowhere. And yet when he told me that and he showed me his vulnerability, I had more respect for him than when he was the manager of a company, because I saw that he was willing to do what it took to make sure that his children were brought up well. Then he was hired by Bendix Corporation, and Bendix offered him a few promotions after they got to know him. But he said after one or two small promotions, he said, I don't want to take any more. I want to just have time for the family. I want to have time for freedom, and time for time to help raise you well. And so he was very conscious he required a lot of me. I was the oldest of three children, and anything I did, when I started to speak and I was at the height of my fame, he would attend a couple of things that I did, and he would say afterwards, I just want to make it clear, I'm not your fan. I am someone here to help you be better. He put it as to criticize you, but from his perspective, criticizing me was a way of making sure I had zero or few Achilles heels, so that I wouldn't be torn apart. And that was hard for a young person, because a father like that, you end up wanting to get the approval of. And at the same time, I was getting a PhD, but he thought I was getting a PhD so I could be, some big cheese like the president of a major university. And so I became the assistant of the president of NYU, and he was very proud, and he thought I was just going to go, real places. And I saw that, the president of NYU was somebody who just was basically raising money. And so I didn't want to be spending, my life raising money. I wanted to do something that like what I'm doing now. But, his attitude was you cannot write a book and you can't write books and be successful. 99% of people don't even get their book published.
True.
And the average person who gets their book published at that time only made, and this was statistically accurate, only $5,000 a year.
Right.
And so he'd point point me to, F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose future wife, Zelda, when they were madly in love, made it very clear to him that there's no way, shape, or form I can marry you until you have a successful first novel or second novel, but you have to be a success before I'm marrying you. So he said, you can't find a publisher, you'll never find a wife. And so he was planted a lot of those seeds in my mind, and yet at the same time I felt this drive to be, I was mentioning to you when we were off script before, about the founding fathers, and as a political scientist, I studied the Federalist Papers, and these were people who, like Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson, who were both intellectuals and activists. And I always found that when I finished a book, like I did with the most recent book I've done is The Boy Crisis, and that's probably the book that's had the most impact on me, because I've seen the degree to which boys are hurting all around the world. And for me, when boys are hurting to that degree and almost no one sees it, and I feel like I have a moral obligation to go beyond just writing a piece of intellectual explanation, that I have a need. It's like writing the preamble to the Constitution, but having nobody see it, that I have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to go beyond just intellectually thinking. Most of my intellectual friends that got PhDs with me, I don't think a single one of them is a major activist. And most of my activist friends don't read very much. And so it's sort of like, and I feel like the founding fathers, I want to read, I want to think, but I also feel I want to spend a good part of my life helping something happen. And so I'm working now a lot with the White House to make sure that the boy crisis is recognized, is put out there before the United States and therefore the world. And so even though I'm more Democrat than I am Republican, I feel the White House has been, and Republicans in general, have been far more understanding of the importance of a father and the importance of family.
Which has moved you even further away from the feminist movement, right?
Yes, exactly.
Become even more of a pariah.
Yes, and it's very fascinating to be caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah. So back to your parents, though. We'll definitely, I want to talk about the boy crisis for sure, but I'm curious about the dynamic between them as parents. So I grew up in a household in which there was co-parenting. Both I and my son are children of divorce. When I was 5, my son when he was 7. But there was always co-parenting. And my mother was a major feminist, by the way, in the 60s and 70s in the Bay Area, and a member of NOW, I believe, but a member of more sort of radical organizations as well. So I grew up in a feminist household in which there wasn't even questioned that, this is how you raise children, where everyone works and everyone raises the kids, and that's the way it is. You said that your father, he had a job which took him away from the home, and this is a major theme in your work, that men sacrifice freedom and power and time, especially with their children, which does not benefit anyone. But then he made this sort of conscious decision at a certain point in his career to take more time,
yes,
right, and maybe make less money as a consequence, right?
Oh, definitely make less money,
which is better. But I think what you're saying is that was a net benefit for you and for him,
yes,
right, and you also prescribed that for others, right? So what was the dynamic, though, as a child between the two? Was there co-parenting, or was he just gone and your mom was raising you for the most part?
My mother was full-time mother,
okay.
and my father worked, and we lived in New Jersey, and he went into the city to commute every day. So he left about 7 in the morning, got back about 7 at night. And so even though that was a normal commute and normal amounts of time, when we lived in a place called Waldwick, New Jersey, in Bergen County, it was, most of the men there, I think probably every man that I knew, except maybe the principal of a local school, worked in went to New York City and got, left about 7, got back about 6 or 7.
Classic.
Yes, classic.
Many novels written about that very thing, right?
Yes,
That's
exactly.
Right. So, okay, then you became an academic, got a PhD, and then you became involved in the women's liberation movement, as it was called then, or second wave feminism, and now specifically when you were an academic. Then I don't think people quite heard this or know, but you became so famous that you were on national television shows on a regular basis in the early 70s. People can go online and can see this, where you're doing your role reversal exercise on national. Was it the Mike Douglas show?
The Mike Douglas show,
and many others, right?
Yes, Alan Alda was
yeah.
one of the contestants in the Fifth Dimension, which was a famous singing group at the time. They were also contestants, and then we had Miss USA and Miss Universe, who were the judges, and so it was and I was on Today's Show, all the major TV shows as frequently as basically I wanted to be, and I wrote for the New York Times and all the major featured in the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera.
And you wrote The Liberated Man.
The first book I wrote was The Liberated Man, and it came out in 1974, and it was basically about the importance of the women's movement, and it did introduce the term success object. So I at that point in time, I guess it was 1974, said yes, women are treated as sex objects, and men are treated as success objects. So that was the introduction within the framework of feminism of the fact that the gender roles cut both ways in terms of objectifying both sexes.
There's more than one way to be objectified.
Yes.
And men do suffer from it, just in a different way.
Exactly. And I want to give Betty Friedan credit here,
yeah.
Too, because Betty Friedan wrote a book, not just The Feminine Mystique, but she also wrote a book called The Second Stage.
Huh.
And this evolved out of many discussions between Betty Friedan and I about the fact that gender roles were very, that they restricted and constrained both sexes. And Betty got that. And it was not just me who introduced that to her. She had her own propensity toward understanding that as well. And so in The Second Stage, she basically said, feminism will plateau and women will not be able to be equal representatives in the workplace unless men are equal representatives at home. And Gloria Steinem also understood that. Gloria put it in slightly different terms, which is that what we need is more women in the place of in work, and we need more men at home. And so both of them had some understanding of, but especially Betty Friedan, of the fact that gender roles restricted both sexes. This was not a plot by men against women. This was a way of restricting both sexes. Now, radical feminists didn't get that. They felt that the nuclear family, based on Lenin, was designed to oppress women and benefit men. But Betty Friedan especially got that. Betty Friedan was a terrible human being to many women in particular. She was a male chauvinist in many ways, ironically.
Yeah, I'm not a fan.
Yes, but she really had a vision that was much fairer. Whereas Gloria Steinem did have, she saw men and the patriarchy more as being the enemy, at least some men as being the enemy, men that didn't agree with the feminist perspective as being the enemy. But she was one of the finest human beings you'll ever meet.
And but she did something to you that's not so fine. But you know why that is about Betty Friedan? It's because she was a communist.
Oh, yeah,
right?
That is true. She was.
The idea about the equality of sexes. I mean, so the whole argument, the thrust of the feminine mystique, published in the early 60s, 61, 62?
63. Right.
63, okay, is that women should enter the workforce. And that was really, that's the main argument there.
Yes.
Women should get out of the home and get into the workforce in positions of economic power. So it makes sense to me that she would see it in sort of class terms.
Yes.
Right? And that the idea would be for women and men to be equal in the workforce and equal at home. Right?
Yes,
that's actually sort of a Soviet idea, as a matter of fact, right?
Yes.
And Gloria Steinem does not come from that background.
Yes.
For people who don't know, Betty Friedan was, I believe, an actual member, or at least a fellow traveler of the Communist Party before she was famous as a feminist. So you had a great relationship with these women, these leaders, these iconic leaders of the women's liberation movement, Steinem and Friedan, for a time, and you were sort of their star in many ways, their male star.
I was the one that helped prove that if Warren Farrell is out there speaking in favor of feminism, then the women's movement cannot be all a hating men movement.
So you disproved that stereotype.
Right. As a token,
the man-hating feminist.
Yes,
right.
Yes,
yeah, exactly. But then you were read out of the movement.
Yes.
Because you started to make an argument about child custody. Is this right? This was the main sticking point?
Yes.
Or the main breaking point, I should say?
Yes. When I made it clear that the early research in the 70s was showing already that children who were raised without a father involvement didn't do as well as children who were raised with father involvement. And that was true for both girls and boys, but especially true for boys. the feminists, they said, well, wait a minute, we are afraid of losing now members who want to be able, after divorce, to do what they wish to do, to leave their old life of a bad decision with a man that they don't feel was right for them, and start a new life. We don't want to inhibit that. And if we do inhibit that, they were getting letters to prove that those from feminists who are now members saying, if you're going to say children should have equal rights, dads should have equal rights to the children, and children should have equal rights to the dads, then we're not going to be a now member anymore. Yeah. And they said, we have more fish to fry than just custody. We have lots of equality issues to fry, and we have to worry about our political support being strong. Yeah. And I understood that from a political perspective, but I said you can't trade off the next generation for a political advantage. Right. Otherwise, you're going to really undermine your long-term integrity. And so they responded by basically saying, well, why don't you go ahead and do more research? You said yourself that the research wasn't really longitudinal, and it wasn't really complete, and the numbers were small. So, but I could see in the eyes of everybody, it was like, if your new research finds that children really need their dads as much as their moms, you can't expect to be getting the 50 speaking engagement referrals per year from us, and your career will basically fall apart.
And let's be clear, am I right? Now's position on custody was they were officially, I believe, against divorced men's custody rights.
Yes, they were
against the rights of divorced men to have custody rights over children at all.
That's right. And
when I found that out, I was blown away. And this was in the early 70s. Yeah.
And their reason for that, even to this day, is that when a woman you don't want to put women in the position where a man who's engaged in domestic violence will have to be equally involved with the children. Now, there's a valid argument to that. Sure. But the truth is that as we have known about domestic violence since the mid-1970s, is that every single major study on domestic violence, that is on domestic violence issues, shows that men and women who are married or living together abuse each other physically about equally. And to this day, we cannot get legislation, and I cannot even. While the White House agrees with me that domestic violence is a two-way street, and that the best thing we could do for it is to teach good communication skills so that people know how to hear each other, so they don't get angry at each other and end up hitting each other, which men and women do about equally. That would be the best solution, prevention of good communication. They cannot get that past the feminists who say that once a man hits a woman, he should not be given a second chance. I had this conversation with the person who was the head of the Department of Justice's section on domestic violence until just recently, when she's now the assistant attorney. She's the principal deputy assistant attorney general, and she got very frustrated that she could not get, even though she's a conservative and she's part of the Trump administration, she could not get past the feminist barriers on that.
I bet that'll take a while. The new Renegade University has new courses on the history of race in America, the politics of sex work with Maggie McNeil, an introduction to Nietzsche with Daniel Coffeen, and my new What is Postmodernism course. We also have a large catalog of courses featuring my Renegade History of the United States series, Scott Horton's courses on American foreign policy, and my histories of the United States in the 19th century and of World War II. We're also about to release 2 brand new courses: The History of Martial Arts with Daniele Bolelli, and an Instructional Design for Dying with Tom Nickel. But what makes Renegade University fundamentally different than all other online universities and even most brick-and-mortar universities is that you get to talk one-on-one with us, the instructors, via what we call office hours. Students and members of RU also can talk to each other on our very own social media platform, which is completely free of censors from Facebook or Twitter or the government. At Renegade University, you can say exactly what you want to say. So join us. Become a member. Go to renegadeuniversity.com. And right now, for a limited time, we are offering 30 to 40% off everything at the brand new RU as part of our grand launch sale. So join the revolution and go to renegadeuniversity.com. So here's my problem with all of this, with second wave feminism. Well, I have many problems, but in terms of what it means, what it has meant in my life, it has meant a whole lot of work. So what we now are expected to do as good feminists, men and women, is to work and raise children. Instead of my mother, who's, I told you, a staunch, lifelong feminist, even once admitted to me, she said this, she said, that old division of labor, not a bad idea. A lot less work involved. So I have had to have a career and raise my child as much as my ex-wife has.
Yes.
It's exhausting. There was no time left to watch TV. Right? I mean, do you feel that that's kind of maybe the fatal flaw or a flaw in that model?
Well, yes. I think that any time you take people who have a multitude of personality propensities and you put straitjackets of what they're supposed to do on any of them, you minimize the potential human contribution. I am by nature a sort of soft, listening, nurturing-oriented person. It is, and I also have strong purpose, strong intellectual interests, and strong active interests. For me, a balancing act of raising children and raising money is the right thing. But for some men, being elementary school teachers and or taking off full time and raising children is more the right thing. And for other men, going out and being the Marines and being the firefighters that we for sure need is the right thing. And the same parallel for women. And so, the beautiful thing that we have, and this is really important, for almost all of history, men did not have freedom. They were any more than women did.
Thank you.
That children were brought up, every generation had its war. And every parent pointed to their uncle who was in the Marines as the hero that was on the top of the credenza, and the boy looked up and got the message that when you grow up, if there's a war and you're needed to fight off so we don't have to speak German, the German as Nazis, not so much the German but as the Nazis, that you have a role to play, and your role was when you're 17, 18 to be willing to be disposable. And if you're disposable and you're killed, we'll call you a hero, and we'll respect you, and we'll talk nice. This will be about you for the rest of your dead years. Right. And so, and if you and when you come back from that war, we need firefighters. We need men in hazardous jobs. And so, 99%, 97% of the people in hazardous jobs are males, and 93% of the deaths in hazardous jobs are by males.
Still,
yes, 93% is the most recent figure.
Totally ignored by feminists.
Totally ignored by feminists. And so so for the first time in history, so in the old days, men learned that their purpose as a male was to be disposable at war or disposable at work. And if you were willing to be disposable, you'd be lionized and be a hero. Today, though, we need fewer men in war, and we need fewer men to be disposable at work because women are sharing more of the responsibilities for that. So the good news is that men have a freedom today to be able to have multiple potential purposes that are more aligned with their personality. But the problem is that the men who go from a purpose void to a dad void don't usually get the discipline and the boundary enforcement and the male role model to have them explore their inner personality and to achieve whatever purpose they want to achieve. So as a rule, if you're a boy and you're a loving, caring boy, and maybe you're artistic in orientation, and let's say you're very good at music, almost always a good mother will encourage her boy to take music lessons and to sing and to join the choir and things like that. But oftentimes, if that boy is very nourished but not disciplined, he has the soul to try out, but not the discipline to be outstanding in his field. it's often the dad that is more likely to say, you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. And the meaning of and the mom will also say that, by the way. But when the child tries to have as few peas as possible in order to eat their ice cream, the mother's and father's response is often different. The mother can often be manipulated by the boy having a bad day and wanting to have fewer peas in order to have the ice cream. The father, because the mother's empathy often comes out, the father will much more likely say, excuse me, we have a deal here. The deal here is you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. Oh, Dad, you're so mean. You can continue whining and crying. There'll be no ice cream tomorrow night either. And eventually the boy learns to focus on doing what what he needs to do, which is to finish the peas before she or he gets the ice cream. And with the mother, the boy learns that he or she doesn't have, the boy learns to be the best way to be coercive, to be manipulative, to get a better deal with fewer peas before she or he eats the ice cream. The important findings that result from this is that the boy raised primarily by dads, only 15% have ADHD. The boys raised predominantly by moms, 30% do. One of the reasons for that difference is because the boys raised predominantly by dads know they don't have a choice but to pay attention to doing what they need to do, finishing those peas, so they don't develop attention deficit disorder. Whereas the boys raised predominantly by moms do not learn that as much.
Okay. Now, as much of a liberated man as I have been, and as much of a feminist co-parent as I was, in fact, the heavy in the relationship with my son. So when we were still married, my wife at the time, this is you just described our household really very much. She would get locked in these sort of endless quibbling arguments with him to try to get him to do things, which would never resolve. But he would sort of get his way. And then I would wait and wait and wait. And finally I would step in and be the brick wall and say, no, you have to go to bed. No, you have to brush your teeth. And if you don't brush your teeth, I will brush them for you. Yes. Now, I also have a lot of lesbian friends.
Let me just stop you there for just 1 second on this. This is very important to the listening audience. So the frustration for moms on this is when dads behave like you're talking about, moms often say, wait a minute, this is so unfair. He says something once.
That's right.
And
it's so easy for him.
It's so easy for him. Yes, exactly. And maybe it's the male tone of voice. Why is this happening? And so she sees all the love she puts into the child, but doesn't realize that the repetition begets repetition begets repetition. And she becomes frustrated. And the child knows on some intuitive level that she or he has more energy than the mother. So this is not a win situation for the mother or the child, and it's certainly not for the father. But one of the main reasons that children do not do as well when they don't have a father involvement is because what you are teaching that boy is this is the end of manipulation and the beginning of doing what you need to do in order to get what you want to have. And if you don't do it, that's not a problem, but you won't get what you want. And there's 150 things that I'm doing for you that you will soon find out I'm doing for you if you want to play with me on that issue.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yes, sure, absolutely. Yeah. But I want to begin. I want to let the world know that I have lesbian friends. Number one.
Yes,
that's how liberated I am. No, but my point was that they have children.
Yes,
and I know a lot of we all do now these days. A lot of lesbian couples with children who would be very cross with you for what you just said. You are not veering into gender essentialism, are you, Warren? Are you suggesting that men are biologically predisposed to be that way and women are predisposed to be their way?
Yeah, I'm saying that biologically the average man is more disposed to be one way than the average woman is. But I'm also saying that there are many times where the women are more the boundary enforcer, and the man can, especially with a daughter, can have that little daughter tie him around his fingers and become very
whether or not it's biological, we can have a separate argument about that. But you are saying it is perfectly possible for a lesbian couple to replicate the kind of healthy relationship that you're talking about.
Yes, there's about 9 differences.
Parenting relationship.
Yes, there's about 9 differences that I talk about in the Boy Crisis between dad-style parenting and mom-style parenting. Statistically speaking, these are true. But But most of these differences, if not all of them, can be learned by either sex. So but it takes a lot. The average woman does not easily enforce those boundaries and not allow an argument or empathy to overcome them, just like with your wife. Mm-hmm. And the average man is more likely to be prone in your direction. But the average man, the father, who feels unvalued for his contribution, soon starts making, on average, more focus on the workplace, because that's where he does get rewarded by his wife. Mm-hmm. And so he may drop out of the parenting process, and the children as a result of that will suffer. So one of the purposes of the Boy Crisis book is to communicate to men that here is the value of of what is more likely to be your natural propensity as a dad. Mm-hmm. And women cannot hear what you don't say. So you, as a father, need to understand that when you roughhouse, it isn't just about roughhousing and being one more child that the mom has to monitor. Mm-hmm. That roughhousing combined with boundary enforcement creates three major important outcomes. It creates empathy. And so almost no mother or father understands how could roughhousing lead to empathy.
Can you explain that?
Yes,
I'm surprised by that too.
Yes, sure. So let's say the dad takes the three kids and throws them on the couch, and the three kids and says, "All right, the game is the three of you have to pin me down before I pin all three of you down together. Okay, you got it. Oh yeah, Dad, we got it." And so the kids, jump on Dad, but in the process, they experience what psychologists call emotional intelligence under fire. And so let's say Big Brother sticks his elbow in little sister's face, and then little sister starts crying, and Mom is sitting here thinking, "Oh my God, sooner or later somebody's going to start crying." She's about 100% likely to be right. Mm-hmm. And so eventually one of the kids starts crying, and Dad usually will say some version of, "Excuse me, you can't. It's nice that you tried to win in the wrestling, but you cannot stick your elbow in your sister's face." And so the child is now beginning to hear that someone else's needs matter, but that doesn't work yet. It's as they continue, and the father gives the children another chance. Then the same behavior happens again in some slightly different form, and the father goes, "Now you are being aggressive. You're not being assertive. Here's what being assertive looks like. Oh, okay, I didn't stick my elbow in my sister's face, but I just pushed her over on the floor. That's being aggressive. Okay, so Mom may say the same thing, but Dad is now giving the children an experience of what being unempathetic is and what being aggressive is. And so, but here's where it really counts. Then the father says, "You do that one more time and there'll be no more roughhousing." And Mom's going, "Twice they've cried and you haven't learned your lesson? You're still roughhousing?" But it's the next time that counts, because when one of the children is too aggressive or makes the daughter or his other brother cry, then the father usually stops the roughhousing and says, "Okay, you broke the rules. There's no more roughhousing till tomorrow night." And so it was the first tomorrow night when the children broke the rules after being warned, that teaches the children that if they're going to get what they want, which is roughhousing, they need to be empathetic to their sisters' or brothers' needs. They need to know what's assertive, not aggressive. And most important, they need to postpone gratification. Immediate gratification is pushing your brother or sister out of the way to win roughhousing. Yep. Postpone gratification is you can't do that to win what you want if you want to get what you want.
Roughhousing is not just a melee, it's a game. And a game has rules.
Yes.
Or a sport, right?
Yes,
exactly. The way you're talking about it sounds to me like a sport.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, men generally have been historically, involved in sports more than women. This is very much changing now, but historically certainly have. And it sounds to me like a coach, teaching an athlete what the limits are, what they can and cannot do. In football, in boxing, in mixed martial arts, whatever it is, there are limits even there, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And that is, it's crucial because the sport doesn't continue if people don't follow those rules.
Precisely.
Roughhousing will not happen if you don't follow these rules, these boundaries.
Right, exactly.
So I understand now that it helps children learn that to follow for certain boundaries, you can do the things that are fun in life and fulfilling.
And here's why it's not women's fault.
Okay.
Because men don't read about these things, but it's also not men's fault, because I've never seen a parenting magazine explain this to anybody. And so, one of the reasons I focused part of the Boy Crisis book on these 9 differences is because I had not seen any book or instructions to parents about what, to help them understand the value of roughhousing, its connection statistically to empathy, its connection to being assertive and not aggressive, and that once somebody is assertive and empathetic, but not aggressive, they are far more likely to have more friends. They're less likely to become depressed. They're far less likely to withdraw. They're far less likely to withdraw into video game addiction. They're far more likely to be attractive if they're boys to females, because with the postponed gratification, they know how to achieve the things that they need to achieve. Women date winners; they don't date losers. Women don't look for men in the unemployment lines who are sleeping in their parents' basement for future fathers. Lois Lane was not interested in Clark Kent at all. It wasn't until he became Superman that she was interested in him. And so the point of all that is that there's a need for us to understand that on average, most men have unwitting ways as fathers of doing things that they don't even understand why they're doing. Women are not to blame because women can't hear what men don't say, and men are not to blame because they have learned to get loved largely by earning money, not by raising children. Even if it was in parenting magazines, many fathers don't read them very much, and so but it isn't in parenting magazines either. So neither sex is to blame. Both sexes need to learn the value of dad being a checks and balance parenting that is equally involved in the parenting process if we want our children to do well. And I don't believe there's a parent that I've ever met that doesn't want their children to do well.
Okay, but you also allow that a woman could serve that function of the father.
Right.
In that sense.
Not only do I allow for that, but I give some really concrete examples where that has happened. Great. So Urban Dove, for example, a school in New York, Brooklyn, and Bedford-Stuy in New York, hires both female and male teachers for young boys who are not doing, boys and girls, who are in jeopardy of dropping out of junior high school and so on. And those male and female teachers, the first 3 hours of school, they focus on coaching the children in physical activities. Both female and male teachers do this. And the female and male teachers do sort of roughhousing and engaging in multiple sports and activities. And then, unlike most coaches who continue just coaching more, those female and male teachers stop the coaching and go around and check into classrooms to see if any boy or girl is having trouble. And if they're having trouble in math, they take their credibility as a coach, helping them to win against the adversary, is transferred to helping them win in against that math problem. The math problem is treated as the opponent, and you're treated as the person who can get to do what you did with the team sport. And so both females and males do this. There's very few behaviors that males do that females can't learn, and there's very few behaviors that males do that females can't learn.
Amen. You stand for gender liberation.
Yes, exactly.
Which you might even say you are a gender abolitionist, perhaps.
I've never thought of the word, but yes, let's see. I guess I'm a gender liberationist more than an abolitionist, because if you want, I believe in the personal freedom that if you grow up and you're more of a firefighter type of male, and that's deep in your personality, then part of liberation is freeing you to be that. I'm not going to abolish your desire, your propensity to be that. But also, I want it to be your choice, not because your father or grandfather was a firefighter and that's the way you knew you would get approval. Yeah. One of the things I talk about a lot in the Boy Crisis book is social bribes. That when we call a boy a hero, we're giving him a social bribe to be willing to be disposable.
Indeed. Great. Yes. Wow. That's I think one of the most liberating ideas of yours for me personally.
Is a social bribe?
Yes, that idea. Well, the whole idea that we are, as men, we are expected to do these things that are awful often for many of us that we don't want to do. We hate doing. A lot of boys hate football. Thank God most of us don't want to go to war, right? We don't want to die in Vietnam for no apparent reason, or even in Germany in the 1940s. For that matter. Yeah, it's very, very liberating. And I really appreciate that contribution you made, among many. This reminds me of, I think it's your third book, The Myth of Male Power, in 93. Or maybe,
that sounds about right.
Which kind of, this was really broke the back of whatever remaining relationship you had with the feminist movement, right? Was this it?
Exactly.
Yeah, this is when they really threw you out entirely.
Why men are the way they are, the head of Ms. Magazine.
They liked that, didn't they?
No.
They didn't like that? But Oprah liked it.
The liberated man they loved.
Yeah.
Oprah loved Why Men Are the Way They Are. She did say it was the first time she really understood men. And she had me on her show repeatedly. And that was one of the reasons Why Men Are the Way They Are became my best-selling book. But many feminists did. So at that time, there was a gap between Oprah and the feminist community. And now Oprah's more she was still feminist in her orientation. And part of her feminism was from having some very bad experiences with males when she was younger. But Why Men Are the Way They Are sort of like opened up her heart to men. And so she was very kind to me when I'd be on her show and somebody would interrupt from the audience. She would like put her arms in front of of that person, and like it was like Moses opening up the sea for me to walk through. Yes.
Wow. Okay.
But the head of Ms. Magazine said, "Warren, you're a naughty boy." Having written this book, she literally called me a naughty boy because I analyzed all of Ms. Magazine's advertising and the mentions of men, and showed that every single mention of men was either negative or as a future source of money, so that they would do De Beers diamond ads and show that the importance of the man buying a diamond that had the right size, the right carats, the right clarity, and then I calculated that man would need to earn $120,000 a year in order to do that, and that's the type of success object that the women were directing these.
So it's this combination of misandry, to use that term.
Yes.
Misandry and an expectation that we earn a lot of money for them.
That's right, exactly. So the man is basically just lovable as a wallet, and if he doesn't, otherwise all the things we say about him are negative.
We trash him.
Yes, trash him. And so I basically broke down every ad that they had for years, and that's why they said I was a naughty boy.
Quick aside, maybe this is not an aside, but I have been absolutely struck and disgusted and horrified and enraged, frankly, over recent years at what I find to be, I think it's a rise in what I would call casual sexism toward men. I have found it to be perfectly acceptable for women, mostly of the middle and upper classes, mostly the educated classes, to say things that are definitionally sexist about men, and not only get away with it, but be celebrated for it, and even get a high five from their sisters for it.
Oh, absolutely.
I have been the subject of this, especially in college campuses. I don't think I've ever been a victim of sexism outside of a college campus. I don't ever feel that at all. But on college campuses, oh yeah, it's common. And I've been denied jobs, and I've been told that I wasn't getting the job simply because I was a man.
Yes.
And I've had many comments about, you're going to watch football this weekend because that's what men do. Or, you're talking like, you're sitting that way in that chair because that's what men do. Disparaging sexist remarks that are completely acceptable and even, as I said, celebrated as sort of, standing up against the patriarchy.
Yes.
I know, I feel like I'm the only person who notices this and calls it out publicly, but I guess you would too.
Oh, absolutely.
You notice
this? I notice it completely,
but no one else seems to.
And I 100% agree with you. I mean, and Women's Studies 101 is basically the sentence that I'm going to say right now. I don't think there's a single women's studies professor that would disagree with what I'm saying, but I will completely disagree with it. But is that we live in a world dominated by a patriarchy in which which men have made the rules to benefit men at the expense of women.
Yep.
And what I'm saying is, as I said before, we live in a world dominated by the need to survive, in which both men and women were restricted to roles that straitjacketed them, women to raise children no matter what their personality was, and men to raise money no matter what their personality was. And like many feminists, I would agree that many women are more suited to raising money, and many men are more suited to raising children. And in fact, that women without children get promoted more quickly in the major corporations than their male counterparts do. And men, when children are left to be raised predominantly by dads and the mother's in an intact family, that demographic of children does better than any other demographic that I can have run across.
Okay.
And so that the people, that percentage of people that want to be hardworking CEO women, those are usually women that are exceptionally good at that. And conversely, with men as fathers, those are men who are usually exceptionally good at that. But the society in the last 50 years has made far more progress freeing women to be in the workplace than they are freeing men to be in the home. I mean, a man knows if he's been a dad and he's been a product of a divorce, that the woman has that in the legal system, the woman has the right to the children and the man has to fight for the children. And I do a lot of expert witness work around the country, and the average father that calls me has already spent $100,000 to be equally involved with his children. I should never have had to make a single penny off of being an expert witness to say what is absolutely obvious, which is that children, because I say obvious because the data has been out there for 30, 40 years, that children do best when they have an equal amount of time. Let me be really practical here. If you are listening and you have your children are a product of divorce, there's 4 things that are what I call 4 must-dos. And these 4 must-dos are: the children need an equal amount of time with mother and father. Obviously, this is not applicable if one parent is totally abusive and so on. But under normal circumstances, they need, number 1 is equal amount of time with mother and father. Number 2 is that dad and mom do not live more than 20 minutes drive time from each other, so that the children don't resent the parents' home that they need to go to because they have to miss their soccer practice or their best friend's birthday party. Number 3, that the child is not able to identify or hear any bad-mouthing from mother to father or father to mother, or even negative body language toward about the other parent. And number 4 is that the children be able to have that the parents have a consistent communication counseling or relationship counseling at least once a month. And so all these are 4 so if you're divorced and you're giving children all 4 of those, equal parenting, living close, no bad mouthing, and equal amount of counseling, your children are on average likely to do almost as well as they would in an intact family.
I and my ex-wife did about 85% of that. But I endorse all of that. The couples counseling thing, that's a hard one to take, especially if it's an acrimonious divorce. But yeah, I think, it would be good. I think it couldn't hurt.
Yeah, especially if it's an acrimonious divorce, it's an important thing to
Yeah, I guess so.
do.
But I certainly endorse the first 3 wholeheartedly, and we certainly tried to do that ourselves before I even heard about you. Oh, I wanted to ask you about this. So I think a huge part of the problem here is the nuclear family itself. That structure, that expectation that we should all live in nuclear families. I think it's a terrible idea. In fact, I think, the idea is you live on an island, you're supposed to raise these children all by yourselves, they're just the 2 of you, raise the money and raise the children and keep the home together. I find to be virtually impossible. I think the extended family model, or the mixed family model, whatever you want to call it, blended family is far better, I think, for children and for parents. Do you agree at all on that?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So I think the father and mother, the children that do best are ones that are raised with a significant amount of input from both mom and dad. Okay. And so that does happen more in the nuclear family than, say, than when a couple's not married. So marriage per se, I'm politically liberal, is not.
Well, I'm thinking more of like immigrant families, right?
Yes.
Other countries, or just people in other countries, right, where the nuclear family is sort of rare. Where I'm thinking of Mexicans, for instance,
yes.
a lot of Mexican immigrants. Yes. I had a guest on the show, Gustavo Arellano, who talked about growing up in the barrio in Irvine, California. Yes. And it was not just mom and dad; it was mom and dad and uncles and aunts and neighbors and friends. And yes. he was raised by dozens
yes.
of adults yes. who all knew him in the neighborhood. And he said it was glorious, and also that it was much better, of course, for his own parents who just had some less work to do.
Yes, yes.
Does that
no,
sound right to you? Okay.
Yes, that does. And here's the problem. Okay. Not that it's a problem with what that is, mm-hmm. but as people, so when you are raised in the type of family that your friend is describing, mm-hmm. when the new person is born, they'll often say, okay, we need a doctor in this, this group, we need a accountant in this group, and you start beginning to sort of see what this extended family needs. Mm. But the more people are successful, the more they tend to move away from those areas. So your most successful kids, I grew up in New Jersey, as you know, and the people in New Jersey who are most successful are mostly living in California now. And so that you tend to move farther and farther away because as you are raised successfully and survival is no longer the issue, that people tend to move to migrate to have freedom, to go to different places. In fact, even the immigrants that come here from Mexico, the ones that are earning the money here to be able to send back to their family, mm-hmm. they are nevertheless away from that immediate extended family, earning money to support the extended family. And so that's why that which you describe, which is of great value, tends to break apart. So in the boy crisis exists, for example, in all of the world's developed nations, the 56 largest developed nations, when the children do the PISA tests, which is the international evaluations of how well they're doing in their scholastic areas, the boys do worse than girls in all 56 of the largest developed nations in most areas of academic achievement, especially in reading and writing, which are the two biggest predictors of success. Now, why developed nations? In developed nations, there's more permission for divorce. In developed nations, there's more permission for children to be raised without being married. And the importance of being raised without being married is that the average family woman that has a child without being married, but even the ones that have fathers living with them at the time, that father involvement remains an average of about 4 years. And then the children see minimal or no father after that period of time on average. Okay. So the success leads to freedom, that leads to people breaking up the extended family. Mm-hmm. And that's because the freedom trumps and leads people to want to explore to even greater and better opportunities. One of the reasons why immigrants often, this country does so well as a nation of immigrants, is because the people who left are often the most adventuresome people, the most confident people, the most competent people. And a nation of immigrants is not a nation of incompetence. It's actually a nation of self-selected competence.
Right. When you go to the White House, can you mention that?
Yes. Oh boy.
Yeah. Okay. Hold on there though. Permission to divorce. I mean, you don't want to deny that, do you?
Oh, I do not want to deny permission to divorce.
I would be very cross with you.
No. I want freedom.
Yeah.
I want permission to divorce. But we have to understand that. But my answer to that, and I am discussing this answer with the White House, is to teach children how to communicate when they're in first, second, third grade in elementary school, and having parenting communication classes for everyone. It can be co-sponsored by your faith-based agency, which is more compatible for conservatives. But every parent, the reason I teach couples communication classes around the country is because the Achilles heel of all human beings is our inability to handle personal criticism without becoming defensive.
You think so?
Yes.
That's it, huh? That's the one.
That's the single biggest Achilles heel.
Huh.
And when you have something to say that you're hurting about or upset about, and you don't feel safe to share that with your partner, you start keeping it to yourself, and that makes you feel unheard and unloved, and that begins to create an emotional divorce. You may decide to be legally married because you're raising their children and you want to be responsible, but oftentimes that legal marriage is also coupled with a psychological divorce. And when children comes, it often means what I call a minimum security prison marriage that many couples are in just because they don't want to break up. And so I'm 100% in favor of freedom to divorce, but I'm also more in favor of training us to be able to communicate with each other effectively enough so that we don't have to feel a need to divorce in order to have our own personal viability.
We're good now. Great. I like it. Okay. Back to your divorce from the feminist movement. So in 1993, you published the book, The Myth of Male Power. And as I said, this was really finalizing your divorce from the formal feminist movement, I guess, the institutional feminist movement. They did not like this book at all. I happen to think it's my favorite of all of your arguments. I think it's the one that really changed. And again, I didn't know about it until I saw the red pill. So this is new to me. I didn't know you had written a book about this because I entered graduate school just before you wrote that book. And you were read out of polite society and academia, basically. You weren't mentioned then at all. And this is why I think I didn't know about you until just recently. But can you just go over what the argument was in The Myth of Male Power, which I think it's a revolutionary just way of thinking about history, actually, that people don't do. I mean, they just don't think of history in this way and how men and women have been treated. And I certainly didn't, I'm actually embarrassed to admit that until I saw you talk about it in the movie. So what is that book and why did the feminists hate it so much?
Yes, it was called The Myth of Male Power, and it basically said that power is about the freedom to be able to be in control of your own life. And that historically speaking, neither sex had power. Both sexes had obligations, both sexes had responsibilities. And that women's set of obligations were to raise the children, and women, no matter what their personalities were pressured into doing that. And women risked their lives bearing children. And men were pressured without regard to their personality into fighting in the war. They had to register for the draft, and they were recruited, and they received social bribes to be willing to be disposable, as I mentioned before. And because we all wanted love and approval and respect, and we all, in strict families that we grew up in historically, we had to do what we were told to do. We learned from the very early years to do what you needed to do as a woman. And if you really loved a man who didn't earn money, you weren't allowed to marry him, as the Titanic movie so famously illustrated. And historically speaking, if you were a man who wanted to write books or be an artist, and unless you were gay and you broke off from the world and society in those years, you had to do not what fulfilled you, but what earned you money. And so when men got married to women, they started to feel like if there was an elementary school teacher or a kindergarten teacher, and this was their passion, that passion was not the issue. You needed to quit being an elementary school teacher to become a principal, or get out of education altogether if it paid too little, get into something that paid more, like selling insurance and if you sold insurance locally, that you should consider it a privilege and power if you were put on, made to sell, given the opportunity to sell insurance nationally. But no one allowed you to think to yourself, wait a minute, is selling insurance nationally going to take me away from my children and have me experience a father's catch-22, that I learned to love the children by being away from the love of the children, and where, my wife often feels lonely and doesn't have me to talk through things with, and, then we end up with a divorce. We feel psychologically divorced. This is not power. This is a set of obligations that, fortunately, the women's movement is encouraging women to think through these straitjackets of femininity, so that if a woman is a brilliant woman who has ambition and would like to have an opportunity to make a difference in the world, we should free her to do that. But who should she be marrying? Her heart should be open to marrying a man who, if she wishes to have children, is more oriented toward loving children and nurturing children and being home with those children, so she can have the freedom to be the have-it-all woman, a woman who can have break through glass ceilings, so to speak, a woman who can have children raised effectively at home, and a woman who can have a loving marriage as well. And so the myth of male power was saying, this is not a world in which men were oppressing women for their own benefit. This was a world in which both sexes had rigid roles from the past that were functional for survival. But now, in those cultures where survival is not the dominating force, where the middle and upper middle class, at least, can begin to have freedom from those roles and be able to treat their children for their personalities, for their unique selves, as Mark Gaffney puts it, rather than just be in a straitjacket of gender roles.
Right. Now, you're not arguing, I think you've said this many times already, I just want to make it clear that it wasn't women forcing this on men or men forcing this on women. It was, am I right that we have internalized these gender roles and expectations and norms ourselves, right? So when asked, in 1939, a man in New Jersey would have said, well, men should go to war. Of course, yes. Women shouldn't go to war. Right. I should go to war, not her, right? And most women, the vast majority of women, even then, would have said, oh, no, women should stay at home and not go to war. They should raise children. Sure. Right, they believed it themselves, and what you're saying is they were straitjacketing themselves in doing so. Is that right?
Yes, they were straitjacketing themselves,
okay.
But also being straitjacketed by the need to survive.
Right. Because we are now post-scarcity, in a post-scarcity society, so the need to survive is less urgent.
Yes, less urgent. We're not in a post-scarcity, but we're in a less scarcity oriented, and at least the middle and upper middle class have a type of freedom. I was teaching my couples class this past weekend at 1440 Multi University. And this is a class teaching people how to be able to handle personal criticism without becoming defensive. And I made it really clear to everybody in the class is that we are all the children of privilege, and that privilege has been created by our parents' ability to earn enough money that has freed us to be able to have the education and the focus to earn the type of money that can now allow us to worry not about survival, but about being able to communicate, moving from role mate to soulmate. And so what I'm there teaching them for a weekend is what I call the art and discipline of love. But the art and discipline of love is not something our grandparents were talking about. They just got married, and she did what she had to do, and he did what he had to do, and neither of them felt really loved or understood. But you were doing what you were told to do, roles-wise. And so the feminist movement made a great contribution to the world by freeing women from the rigid roles of the past. But it made a terrible contribution to the world by calling men the oppressors and women the oppressed. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of the evolution of human beings and also of animals. Even among animals, almost 85% of the reproduction among almost all animals is by the female with the alpha male, the number one. And an example of that is the buck elks, for example. The females almost always marry the alpha male that has the biggest rack. But that biggest rack, in order to get that biggest rack, the alpha male has to consume about 30% of his minerals and nutrition and calcium. And so the alpha male is so... and if that alpha male doesn't get rid of that big rack immediately, by doing the rutting process, getting rid of that rack by rubbing it against a tree, that alpha male will be likely to die before the winter season because it can't replenish its nutrients. And that's a perfect example of what masculinity is about, that men's weakness is our facade of strength.
Yes.
And the female is attracted to that facade of strength because that rack can be used to kill off enemies. But what is not considered is that rack also kills him off as well. And that's what the core of the myth of male power is about.
Yes.
That men's weakness is their facade of strength. It is not liberation. It only appears as power. But the price of getting that power is powerlessness.
Yes. An actual death.
An actual death.
That's
yes,
right.
Exactly.
Warren, I want to thank you for doing this, and I want to thank you for putting ideas into the world that made me freer.
Thank you. That's really one of the nicest things that could be said about the myth of male power or the boy crisis or any book I've written.
Yes, your whole career, I think, has created a world in which I can do many more things that I couldn't have done before you did it. And I really appreciate that. And
I hope it frees women
and of course,
to have men that are free to do the types of things like raising children that will serve women who really want to make it in the world in a impact type of way.
Yeah. Well, keep going and good luck at the White House.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To get more information and to buy tickets for the upcoming Renegade University weekend in Oakland and San Francisco in April, go to renegadeuniversity.com/live. Thanks for listening.